further ado, Jenna, take it away.
Thank you, Maddie. So yeah, as Maddie said, I'm a digital archives technician at the Shingok Residential School Center. And I just want to preface the presentation by saying that I am a settler, I'm not Indigenous. And so I am coming at this from a settler perspective, although I am trying to learn as much as I can about the Indigenous groups in Northern Ontario, learn as much as I can about the culture and language, and try and incorporate Anishinaabe, Cree, Métis viewpoints in my work. But of course, I do definitely accept comments, recommendations. If people have things they want to suggest about the way I'm approaching this, feel free to reach out to us. I really appreciate different viewpoints on this kind of work. So today, this is just sort of a quick agenda of what I'm going to cover. So doing family research is fairly complicated. There's a lot of different parts that go into this. There's going to be a lot of information here for you today. There is a handout. I don't know if Maddie's put it in the chat yet, but it does have a lot of the information that's in the presentation. It's got lots of links in there as well. And additionally, this is going to be recorded. So it will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you are not starting your research yet, and you're just sort of, figuring out how to get started, eventually when you go and do start, if you want to come back to our presentation on YouTube and review anything, or go through the handout, you're definitely welcome to. So I'll talk about how to get started, the different sort of steps you need to take when you're first carrying out family research. I'll talk about census and vital records, what they are, where to find them, how to understand them. Talk about church records, same thing, residential school records. I'm just only going to touch on this really briefly because we have done a webinar previously on how to search for residential school records, and that is also on our YouTube channel. So you're welcome to go and look at that for more information on how to research residential school records. So just in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much on that. And then finally, I'll talk about treaty annuity pay lists and different records that are in Library and Archives Canada. And then there'll be time for questions at the end. And as Maddie said, if you have questions, you can post them in the Q&A and in the chat throughout, and we can cover those at the end. So I'm going to go through all these, and then at the end, I'm going to do a case study with my husband's family. So as I mentioned, I am a settler, so I don't have any Indigenous family members to research, but my husband does. So I'm going to be using his family to kind of show how you go about finding these different kinds of records and some of the challenges that I face in doing this kind of research. And just to sort of give a brief background of where this presentation is coming from, I've been doing genealogy for a number of years. And when I started doing Indigenous genealogy, I was doing it down south. I was actually doing a lot of research around the Six Nations area. And then I started researching my husband's family, moved up here, started researching for other people who are coming into the SRSC. And so this presentation is really born out of the differences that I was noticing in how complicated it is to search in Northern Ontario versus Southern Ontario. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. So if you are interested in searching your family history, which I'm sure most of you are because you're here, one of the first things you can do is talk to family members. So that could be your parents, your grandparents, if they're still alive, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, anybody you can get a hold of that you're related to. Talk to them and find out what they know about your family history. Sometimes even, your own sibling could have different information than what you have. And when you're talking to all these family members, it's really, really important to make sure you take notes and always keep track of your sources. And this is important because you will find contradictory information. People have a different idea of when somebody was born, where somebody was born, what their actual name was. Sometimes you can have information that's all over the place. So if you're keeping track of where you get that information, that can be really helpful in trying to understand what is the correct information. So it's always good and always important to take notes and keep track of where you're getting information. So when you're talking to family members, the kinds of information you want to look for is names. Of course, that's sort of the most obvious, the biggest thing. And it's helpful to find both the English and Indigenous name if known. Oftentimes, Indigenous people had their names changed, whether it was because of the Indian agent, because of residential school. There could be various different reasons why people had their names changed. So if you know what the name was before it became anglicized, that can be helpful in tracing back further in time, because it's not always going to be an anglicized last name as you go back further. And sometimes the name can be translated from the language, so I'll talk about that a little bit later, or it could just be a brand new English name. So it's helpful if you know both. Of course, it's also helpful to know dates, but if you don't know the exact date, don't worry. It can still be helpful even if you just have a range or an estimate. So if you have a time frame when somebody died or a time frame when somebody was born, that can be helpful. Or, you know, okay, my grandmother died when I was about 7, I think, so she probably died around that year. That can be helpful, even if you don't know the exact date. If you just have that estimate or that range, that at least gives you a starting point, so you're not searching through, 50 years of records. If you can narrow it down to even, 5 or 10 years, that can make it a lot easier. Also helpful to know the community and region, so where the person came from, where they lived. People often moved around a lot, so it's helpful to know if they bounced around from band to band. Band membership, that can also be helpful because that will help you figure out which annuity pay list to look for, which I'll touch on later. But again, even if you only have broad information, even if you just know that they were Anishinaabe or you just know that they were Cree, that can still give you a starting point. So, with a lot of this, my whole point is if you can't get a lot of information, if you are older and you don't have those older family members to talk to and your siblings don't know too much, don't worry and don't feel like there's nothing you can do, because even just having that broad information can give you a starting point. And residential school or day school, important to ask about this information, whether they attended or not, and when and where they might have attended. This can be a really complicated issue to figure out, even just to figure out if somebody attended. So again, if you don't find information on this from talking to family members, don't worry, it's something that you can try and search for along the way. Another thing I don't have on here, but is something that might be helpful to ask family members about, is clans. This is something that you're not going to get from Western records. I have never found a Western record so far that lists a person's clan. So if this is something you're interested in finding out, this is something you're really just going to get from those oral conversations, from talking to people. But it can be something, again, that just sort of fills out the story of the person and of their family. So definitely something to ask about to see if people know. A couple other things to note in terms of getting started. And this first point is more for people who are not Indigenous and might be helping Indigenous people do their research, but just noting the importance of oral history. Families often have stories about where they came from, about individual people in their family, or connections to a famous ancestor. So oral history plays a lot in genealogy. It is really important. But one thing that is different with researching Indigenous family members is it's really important to take Indigenous oral history as a fact on its own. And this, for people who are settlers, can be a really hard shift to jump into. I know this is a struggle for me when I started researching, is I always wanted to find that piece of Western record to prove something, and I wasn't really considering it as a fact until I had found that record. But when it comes to Indigenous ancestors, sometimes the records just don't exist. And often oral history is true. It is fact. And so it is really important to treat it as such. Of course, the more evidence you have, the better. So don't let, that viewpoint of treating Indigenous oral history as fact, don't let that stop you from continuing to search, but don't feel like you have to find something to corroborate it. Again, it's more just like a mental shift than actually changing, your actions and doing your research, but it is an important shift to keep in mind when doing this kind of searching. Another thing that I found really helpful in my research is language comprehension. So knowing some Anishinaabe or some Cree can help you understand a person's name, different variations of the name, the way it may have changed. So as I mentioned, sometimes when people had their names anglicized from the Indigenous last name to an English last name, sometimes it was just a straight translation. And so understanding what the word in English means in Anishinaabe, then that can help you figure out, connect those two people who are actually the same person, just with a different last name. So I found this really, really helpful. I don't know everything. I've only been taking the language for 2 years, so I am definitely not fluent. I use online dictionaries all the time. So that is a tool you can use as well. If you don't have time, you're just really struggling with learning the language, you can always use those online dictionaries as well. But having sort of some general understanding of how the language works and just sort of, general grammatical things about the language, I found that to be really useful. And finally, knowledge of local history. So this is really, really useful when figuring out where to start your search and what kind of records to look for. So understanding the history of colonization in the area, how far back were there settlers in the area, because that can help you figure out how far back the records actually exist. And were there fur trade posts, rail lines, mining, that can give you an idea of what kind of archives to look for. So if there's fur trade posts, maybe you want to look at the Hudson's Bay Company archives. I don't talk about that too much in this presentation, but that is another line that you can go to. You can look for these different companies and see maybe your family worked for this company, and that might give you more information about their life. Also important to note, were there nearby missions? And if so, what denomination? Because that will help you know what church to look for, whether you're going to be searching in Anglican, Jesuit, Catholic, knowing, what the nearby church was to the community they lived in will, kind of help you figure out where to look. And finally, again, this is a really broad thing. What treaty covers the area? Treaty annuity pay lists are a useful resource. So knowing what treaty the community that your family is from is covered under will help you figure out which pay list you're actually looking for, or even if a pay list does exist. So again, that's just sort of that broad idea. And again, that will give you more information about dates as well. So this is where you really start to struggle when you go back further in time. If there's no treaty that covers the area, it's really unlikely for you to find information about individual people the further back in time you go. So with the Robinson treaties, those were signed in 1850, it's going to be a struggle to find information further back than 1850 because there isn't that individual, list of people when you go back further than that. And when you get into Treaty 9, that was only signed in 1905, again, it's really a struggle to get back further than that. And so this is something that is really unique to these northern communities because these treaties are not old treaties. And, in terms of researching Western family history, it's really easy to go back much, much farther than that because you get back to the countries that people came from. But with Northern Ontario, it really just depends on when the treaty was signed, and it's going to be really hard to go back further than that. So one of the first types of records that I usually search in is census records. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with census records, I'm sure all of you just recently filled out the 2021 census. So census records are recorded every 10 years. And they've been recorded every 5 years since 1971. So when you go back further in time, they're going to be 10 years apart. The first official federal census was in 1871. But census records in Ontario and Eastern Canada go back to 1842, and census records in Quebec go back even earlier. So depending on where your family is from, you might be able to get back into those earlier years. Census records are made public after 92 years. This is privacy legislation, so that information about living people is not released to the public. So right now, up to the 1921 census is available. In 2023, the 1931 census will become available, which I'm really excited for. That's going to give us a lot of really great information. Census records are available for free through Library and Archives Canada. So I have a link in the handout for that website for where to search. But they're also available on membership-based websites like Ancestry, Family Search, and MyHeritage. So if you use one of those sites, you can find census records on there. And so when I get into my case study, I use Ancestry. So that's the one that I'm going to be walking you through a bit. But again, these census records are available for free if you don't want to pay for a membership on one of those sites. Oh, okay. I think, okay, it's just clicking really slow for me. So some sort of things to note about searching in census records in Northern Ontario is Northern Ontario communities aren't always indexed very well. So sometimes you have to browse by the area. So this is where local history can come into play, knowing which area to actually search in. And I'll cover this a little bit when I go into my case study and show you how to actually browse. But it is an important thing to note that sometimes using the search function doesn't actually give you any information, but that doesn't mean that the person's not there. Tied into this, making it more difficult to search is spelling of names. So there can be spellings all over the place. Oftentimes the people who were writing these Western records, they don't understand the local language. And so they have trouble transliterating those words into Western script. So this means there's different spellings everywhere. So I have an example here from my husband's family. These are only just 3 different spellings that I've come across. There's definitely way more than this for this particular name. And so that can cause a lot of difficulties when you're trying to use the search function, because if you search that first spelling, records with the second spelling are not going to come up because it is a different language. And so the search functions can't really identify that it's actually the same word. Unfortunately, they're not really set up to work with languages like Anishinaabe, Mon, and Cree, and to recognize that this is the same word. So browsing can help with this. And so you'll see some examples of where I had to browse and where I found the person I was looking for, despite the fact that the spelling was wildly different than what I thought it was. And as I mentioned earlier, names often change. So Indian agents often force people to adopt European surnames and first names if they hadn't already. Students' names could be changed when they attended residential school. But one thing that I've noticed is common is often the Anishinaabe name of the father will become the last name of the child. So the child will have an English first name and then take their father's name as their last name. And then later on, that last name might be translated into English or changed further. So I have this example in my husband's family of this, so I'll show that later. So some other records that I go to first are what are known as vital records. So these are birth, marriage, and death records. And in Ontario, it is required to register birth, marriages, and deaths with the province. But depending on how urbanized an area is, they may not have registered with the province. It could depend on whether there was an Indian agent there or not, or a missionary in the area. They might just not have had the opportunity to register with the province. So these records might not actually exist for some communities. The family also might not belong to a European religion and therefore feel no obligation to register. So you can find these vital statistics through church records as well. So often if people weren't registering directly with the province, they were registering with the church community. But if they didn't subscribe to a European religion, they wouldn't necessarily be registering these events with the church or with the province. And again, the community might be so isolated that there is no Indian agent or missionary, there's no opportunity to register. And so sometimes you might find registrations of birth, marriages, and deaths years after they happened because there was nobody around when that event happened to actually register it. And some people may actually have deliberately not registered for potential political reasons. So they're not happy with the settlement in the area. They don't like the Indian agent. They don't like the church. So they decide, we're specifically not going to register. We're going to go off in the bush when this guy comes to town, and we're just going to not have anything to do with this. So that could be another difficulty in finding records, is they may have deliberately not created them. So when it comes to these vital records, keep searching, but don't spend too much time or get too discouraged if you can't find these records, because they just might not exist. But again, with all the difficulties around names and, spellings, etc., it might just be that you just haven't come across it yet because it's kind of difficult to find. So again, keep searching, but if it's taking you forever to find something and you're just getting nowhere, it might just not exist. So church records are another great resource that I mentioned. So again, due to lack of opportunities to officially register vital events with the province, the church might hold records. People also might be registered with both. That's also common. So when you're trying to figure out which church to look for, which types of records to look for when it comes to churches, pay attention in the census records to what denomination the family belonged to. So when I pull up a census record, I'll show you what this looks like, but they will list whether the family was Roman Catholic, whether they were Anglican, whether they were Methodist, et cetera, et cetera. The census will list that. So it's important to note that, and then that'll help you figure out where to look. And again, this is also where local history knowledge about the local missions comes into play. So was there a church or a mission nearby, or did the family or missionary have to travel? So when you get into really far north communities, sometimes they had to travel somewhere else to be able to register these events. So where the event is actually registered is not necessarily reflective of where the family lived. And again, related to established. So if it was established, in the 1880s, then you might not find records beyond that when you go further back. And another thing to note is the church is still there. So sometimes the churches themselves will hold the records. So you might be able to contact the church if it still exists, and they either will have the records or they'll be able to tell you, hopefully, where the records are now and where you can access them. So another reason to pay attention to the denomination is the difference in difficulty of finding Anglican records versus Catholic records. The Anglican records are generally much easier to deal with than Catholic records. Most of the documents are with the Synod archives. They might be in a local repository that they can direct you to, but they generally have a good sense of what records they have and what records they don't. There is sort of a central organization to them. So it is a little bit easier to figure out where and what those records are. You might have to pay a small fee to the local archives to search and retrieve documents for you. But the SRSC is a local repository for Anglican records. And we actually just recently were able to get rid of the fee for Indigenous people to search, which is great. So depending on the place, you may have to pay a fee, you might not. You'll have to find out when you go there. Catholic records are much harder because there is no central repository or organization. There's various different groups that all sort of organize their own records. So you really have to go digging for these records to find out where they are and if they still exist. A lot of Catholic records are really spotty. So they may have existed at one point, but don't anymore. So it can be a lot more difficult to try and find them. Residential school records, as I mentioned, it can be really difficult because you might not know which school they attended, and it can be difficult to figure out which school they attended because the community they're from doesn't necessarily inform which community they were sent to. So depending on religion, two neighbors could end up at schools across the province from each other because one was sent to an Anglican school and one was sent to a Roman Catholic school. So the community they're from doesn't necessarily determine what school they went to. And Indian agents sometimes work to separate siblings. So even within the same family, they could be sent to different schools. And an agent may have brought a child to a school only to find that it was full and then send them on to a different school. So there are a lot of difficulties if you don't already know what school they attended in figuring out what school they attended. Not all records about residential schools are accessible. Some may be kept locked due to privacy concerns, so especially if it's more recent records or related to people who are still living, unless you are that person or your next of kin if the person is deceased, it can be really difficult to get access to the records. Often the records aren't indexed, so there's no index of names in the record. You can't search by name, you have to manually browse through them. And this is the case with Library and Archives Canada. any of the records they have online that are available are not indexed by name. So you have to search for the school, and then there can be hundreds and hundreds of pages to browse through. So it can take a really long time. It can be really discouraging if you get to page 350 of 600 and you still haven't found the person you're looking for. So the only thing I would say to that is just to have patience. And the person you're looking for could be on page 490 of 490. So it is worth it to search through to be able to find them, but it does take a long time. Many residential school records have been destroyed. And so this is still going on as the Supreme Court ruled that records detailing abuse at residential schools that were collected as part of the independent assessment process can be destroyed after 15 years. So you do have to specifically go in and tell them you want them to keep your records. And a lot of people might not know this or might not, be able to get in touch with them. So it is still ongoing, this destruction of records. And it means that attendance lists can be really spotty for residential schools. And so you might know that a family member attended a specific residential school at a specific time, but the attendance list for that year just might not be there. And so that's the case with my husband's family, is we just don't have the records. They're not around. Of course, you can come to us at the SRSC for help with residential school records. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation does also have lots of information. And of course, we have that webinar that's on our YouTube channel that you can go to for lots more information about how to search residential school records. So treaty annuity pay lists are another type of record that can be helpful when doing genealogical research. And so these are lists of individuals who receive annuity payments in accordance with the treaty. So these only exist if you are part of a treaty that has annuity payments. There's a lot of treaties in Quebec and Southern Ontario that don't have annuity payments as part of them. But Treaty 9 and the Robinson treaties do have annuity payments associated with them. So you should be able to find these pay lists. They can have a lot of information, but they are not without issues. So women who married white men often lost their status and their children were not given status, so then they don't show up on these pay lists. Also, the Gradual Enfranchisement Act removed status from individuals, which meant they lost their treaty rights, including annuities. So there could be various reasons around the Enfranchisement Act for people to be removed from these pay lists and not show up. And it's usually only the heads of households that are recorded. So it's just the man, and then you don't have the name of the wife and the name of the children in that household. So it does have limited information, but it can give you something. It can tell you, they were together at this point, this couple, they did have this many children. So it can give you some information, and I'll show some examples of what these pay lists look like. Lots of them are accessible through Library and Archives Canada. Some are available online, but again, they're not indexed and the organization can be really confusing. I really struggle to find the pay lists I'm looking for on Library and Archives Canada. So you're always welcome to reach out to us at the SRC, Library and Archives Canada, for help in trying to find the pay list you're looking for. Library and Archives Canada, of course, nobody's allowed to visit in person right now with COVID lockdown. But once things open, even if you're not able to visit in person, you can order the records that are not available online. But again, there's poor organization, poor description, and so this can be really expensive if you're not even sure if the record you found is the record you're looking for. But that is an option. You can order the records. They are digitizing lots of records related to Indian Affairs documents, which is the RG10 series. So if you find a record and it's not available online yet, you can bookmark it and come back and check later, because they are taking, making efforts to digitize lots of these records. So I did have some records that I was looking for when I first started doing my husband's family research that were not available online at the time. And then I went back a year or so later and they were available. So it is worth checking back if it's not available at the time and you don't want to order it. Some are also available online on Canadiana, and I think there is a link in the handout, but this is only for a limited number of treaties and doesn't include the Robinson treaties and Treaty 9. So it's helpful if you have family that came from out west and maybe moved into Ontario, and you want to go back further and find family members in those treaties. But the treaties in Northern Ontario are not part of that listing on Canadiana. And there's similar privacy around these with census and birth records. So I didn't actually talk too much about the privacy around vital statistics, but there is also similar privacy with the census around those. So again, just making sure that information about people who are still living is not released to the public. So these annuity pay lists are only released for public viewing after 100 years. So annuity lists from 1921 should be available this year. Whether they're accessible online is another question. But if you are able to find the record, the listing online and want to order a copy, you should be able to do so. Or once Library and Archives Canada opens, you should be able to go in person and look at those annuity lists from 1921. Okay, so I'm going to start in on this case study. So I'll sort of explain a lot of the information I've shared already and how that actually plays out in doing actual research. So when I started researching my husband's family, I started with his grandmother, Linda, who's a member of Rocky Bay First Nation. So I sat down and talked with her about, any family information she could remember, any family information she knew about. So I asked for names and dates of her parents, siblings, grandparents, and great-grandparents. I personally like to go back to great-grandparents because for people of my generation, so if you're younger, anybody more recent than great-grandparents is still going to be locked for privacy. So you're not really going to be able to find much information because it's still too recent. If you are of an older generation, information about your parents might already be online. So you might not need to go back that far. But that's just a personal preference for me. I like to try and go back as far as I can. And people who do know information about their family, generally they don't know past their great-grandparents. A lot of people don't know past their grandparents. So that's sort of just a good sort of frame of mind to work within is, try and go back to great-grandparents, but if you can't, that's okay too. So Linda had a really good mix of information she knew and information she didn't know. So this is a great way to show, that there was a lot of information missing, and I really had to work off of the small amount that I had. So she knew names of her siblings, parents, grandparents, and some of her parents' siblings. And she knew some birth and death dates, but not all. So she didn't know death dates or birth dates for her grandparents. I think she didn't know a lot of the birth dates or death dates for her siblings. So there was a lot of missing information there. She thought that her father's family might have been from Gull Bay and that her mother's family was from Fort Hope, but didn't know how or when they ended up in Rocky Bay. So that was something that I had to try and figure out when they actually came to more, southern Lake Nipigon. And she thought that maybe her mother attended residential school, but didn't know which one she had attended. So more sort of getting started stuff. I've started doing a little history research into the Lake Nipigon area. So found out, of course, that it was part of the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. This was back when I was sort of just starting, researching Indigenous history in this area and just starting my job at the SRSC. So all this stuff now is just sort of common knowledge to me, but at the time I didn't know it. So I had to go and actually research what treaty is this community part of. And I learned a bit more about the history of Gull Bay Reserve because that's where Linda thought her family was from, as well as the Nipigon Reserve, which is the historic reserve that covered a bunch of the groups around Lake Nipigon. And I started doing some general research on what reserves exist in the area now. So there was a lot of Wikipedia searching to find out the names of the different communities and when they were established. So the Nipigon Reserve is sort of the historic reserve that covered a large portion of Lake Nipigon, and then it was eventually parceled out into different groups. So now there's a bunch of different reserves that are all different communities around Lake Nipigon, but further back in time, they were all just one group. And I also got in touch with a local historian who, funny enough, actually ended up being a relative and had tons of information to share with me. So it's really great to be able to reach out to those local historians, local history communities, because they may have information that your family might not have, and you might end up finding out that they're related to you. So when I started searching online, I started by looking for Linda's father, Charles Thompson. And so based on talking to her, I knew that Charlie was born in 1914 or around 1914, and that his parents were Joe and Marianne Thompson. Excuse me. She also knew that they did have an Anishinaabe last name prior to Thompson, which she thought was Nenny. So I did have, some information related to a name change. So I started searching in the 1921 census, and that's usually where I start, is 1921, because again, that's the most recent census that's available now. So it's always best to start with the most recent information that you can get online. So I searched on Ancestry in the search bar for Charles Thompson, born 1914, and that gave me over 100 results, but none of them are relevant. And I knew that they were relevant by searching the community, and none of them were the area I was looking for. So then I did the same search, but changed the last name to Nenny, and that brought me 4 results, so a lot less to sift through. But again, none of them were the right one I was looking for. So I decided to start browsing through the records. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is where the local history comes into play, because you need to know which district and sub-district to choose, and you might have to search through multiple areas. So I'm going to pull up Ancestry here and show you what this looks like. So as I mentioned, Ancestry is the one that I use most often. You can search for census records on Library and Archives Canada. I'm not really sure how browsing works on Library and Archives Canada. I think it might be a little bit more difficult, but you certainly can do that on there as well, because they are available. So Ancestry gives you this option of searching by province first. So I know I'm looking for Ontario. District, there is a lot of districts to search through. So by doing that local history research, I knew that the communities in Lake Nipigon were probably included in the Port Arthur and Kenora district. So I would click on that one, and then there's a number of sub-districts. And I think when I was searching, I searched through almost every single sub-district, and I'm pretty sure it was the last sub-district that I checked. So again, it can be really time consuming to browse through these all, time consuming to figure out which is the right sub-district. So you're going to have to search through multiple of them before you find it. Eventually I did find it. So as you can see, it's sub-district 29A, which I think is close down to the bottom here, down here. So I did have to search through a couple other reserves to be able to find that. So this is what a census record looks like. This is the 1921 census. And so you can see at the top, it says Ontario, and the sub-district, it just says Indian Reserve. It doesn't say which specific one. But fortunately, the 1921 census does have community names here. So this line here is the community name. So even though at the top it's just really broad, and at the sub-district here it's really broad, you can narrow down here. So when I was browsing, I was keeping in mind those 2 names, Thompson and Nenny. And then I came across this, there's Nenny. And so that is pretty similar to what I had heard from. And then I see there's a Charles there. So I know I'm looking for a Charles Thompson / Charles Nenny. And there's parents Joseph and Mary. And so I know from Linda that those are Charles's parents' names. I also did get sibling names from her as well. So there's a John there and a Lillian. And so I know that those are siblings of Charles. So I'm pretty confident that this is the Charles I'm looking for, even though the last name is slightly different. And this is another challenge with researching Indigenous ancestors. When it comes to settler ancestors, because there are so many people that have the same name, like there's endless numbers of John Smiths around, you have to get really specific about the spelling and really specific about community and date. With Indigenous ancestors, you really have to just get to that close enough point. So it's not going to be exact because of those different spellings, because people don't know how to actually write the name. It's just a matter of close enough. So Nani versus Nanine, close enough. And it's got all the right family members in it. And it is in the right community. It's in Grand Bay. So I know that that is the area of Lake Nipigon that I'm looking for. That's southeastern Lake Nipigon, which is nearby Rocky Bay. So it's got multiple things that I know I'm looking for. Then if we scroll over, it'll have family relationships here. So this is helpful because sometimes you'll have grandchildren living with grandparents, or you'll have nieces and nephews living with their aunts and uncles. So it is good to take a look at that. And this one is kind of obscured, but I know it says head, wife, son, and daughter. So I know that these are all children of Joseph and Mary, and that Joseph and Mary are a couple. They might not be officially married, but in terms of what the census taker knows, they're considering themselves married. It's got ages here. So I know that Charles was born around 1914, according to Linda. Charles here is 10. Ages in the census are really iffy. They're definitely not something to rely on. They can be wrong all over the place. So again, it's sometimes a matter of close enough. And so 1911 versus 1914 is pretty close. And again, I have all this other corroborating information to tell me that these are the right people I'm looking for. Further over, this information here is not in every census. So when you go back further, sometimes it's not here, but it'll have the person's birthplace. So they were all born in Ontario. And then it also has the father and mother's birthplace. So I know that Joseph's father and mother were both born in Ontario, and Mary's father and mother were both born in Ontario. Again, this is not always accurate because it depends on who was giving the information to the census taker. So nowadays we get the census record, we filled it out online this year, unless you specifically requested a paper copy. But further back in time, they would have a specific person who would come around and record the information. So sometimes it just depended on who answered the door that day, who was home, and what information they knew. So always good to take note of what the census is telling you, but sometimes it's not always accurate. Going back further down the record, it does list these people as Indian. That's usually the term that these records in the past will use. Sometimes it'll get specific and it'll say Ojibwe, Cree, Potawatomi, et cetera, but most of the time it'll say Indian. So if you have somebody who does have an anglicized last name, that might potentially be a common last name. If they have Smith as a last name, you can check what the census lists as their race. So if you have somebody who's the same name, same age, same community, but they're listed as white, that might not be the right person you're looking for. It also here lists whether they speak English or not. So apparently this whole family didn't speak English at all. And then it lists the language they spoke instead. So they spoke Ojibwe instead of English. So that's interesting to note because I know that apparently none of them were attending a residential school because none of them spoke English. This also has the religion. So as I mentioned, it's important to note that RC is short for Roman Catholic. You can see further down there's C of E, which is Church of England, that's Anglican. So I know that when I'm searching for church records, I'm going to be searching in Catholic records, and there's not going to be anything in Anglican records because the family was not Anglican. Sometimes they'll have the job. So I can see that Joseph was working as a trapper. Most of the people in this community are working as trappers. When you get into northern communities, that's going to be mostly the case. They're going to be trappers or hunters. Sometimes they're lumbermen, sometimes they work on the railroad. So it's not necessarily going to help you find more records, but it is interesting to note that that's what that person was doing for a living. So that's what a census record looks like. That's the kind of information you can find from a census record. But again, because I didn't know that this record spelled the last name as Nanine instead of Nani, because I was searching Nani, nothing was coming up. Obviously, that doesn't mean that Charles is not in this record because I found him here just with a different spelling. So I had to come browse to find that. And you can also see from the transcription over here Just down here, I want to note father's name. It says Jas Nanine. And two things to note there. I know the father's name is Joseph. So somebody has transcribed that wrong as Jas, which would be short for James and not Joseph. So if I was trying to search for Joseph Nanine, he's not going to come up because his name is written as Jas. So it's always important to actually take a look at the record instead of just the index. Even if you find a person by using the search function and the transcription comes up, you're going to still want to open the actual record because the transcription isn't always right. And further to that point, when I look at this spelling of Nanine, the way I would read this is Nanine. And the way that it's written here is Nene. So that's just another thing to note why it's important to go and look at the actual record itself. Another thing I wanted to note, and this is sort of tied into getting information from family members and always keeping track of your sources. So I had limited information about Joseph, who is Charles's father, Linda's grandfather. All I knew was that his name was Joseph Thompson and that he had this last name, Nenny, or as I now know, Nanine, as it's showing in this record. But I didn't know anything else about him, didn't know if he had a different Anishinaabe name or didn't know a birth date or anything like that. So Ancestry has this function where you can look at hints. And so that will show you records that it thinks is the correct person. It'll also show you other family trees that people have on Ancestry that might have the same person. So I'm looking at the hints for Joseph and scrolling down, I see that there's one here and they have this name Mitigo in there. And so I've never heard that before. I don't know where this person got that information, but I note it down because it might be helpful in searching. It's important not to just blindly copy from these trees on Ancestry. I see that all the time where as a source, people will source other family trees on Ancestry. That person will source another tree. That person will source another tree. Who sources another tree that has no sources? So I have no idea where this information is coming from. Not sure if it's actually correct. So I don't want to just directly put it into my tree and say that it's correct. I want to note it down because it might help me search. And in fact, it did help me search. You can also message the person who owns the tree to find out where they got that information. So that's again related to talking to family members, talking to community members. This person might have access to a source that you don't have access to. So here's an example of a vital statistic record. So this is a death record. And I found this one again by browsing. And so you can see this is in a different district than the census was. So the census was Port Arthur and Kenora. Port Arthur is the same as Thunder Bay. It's just a different and an older name for Thunder Bay. So I know that any district that has the name Thunder Bay is possibly going to be the right district as well for me to look through. And I know that today the modern district is, sort of part of the wider Thunder Bay district. And then it says Division Indian Reserves. Again, it doesn't give specific community. You have to look at the actual record for that. So I see here there's this Louis Harper. And so I'll go to a different record in a minute to show you why I know that the Harper family is one of the families I'm looking for. It's Charles's wife's family. So as I'm browsing through, I'm keeping track of all these last names that I'm looking for. And so I see this Harper, so I scroll down and I see name of the father is Gilbert Harper, and name of the mother is Rosie Shabwagijik. And so I know from talking to Linda that these are her mother's parents. So in most of my example, I've been talking about her father's side of the family, but I also did get information about her mother's side of the family. So the spelling I had for Rosie's last name was totally different than this. The way Linda pronounced it was Jabwagijik, or Jabwagijik. So it was different than what I was looking for. But again, it's one of those things where it's spelled multiple different ways. I've only just started researching this side of the family in the last week or so because I was having so much trouble with the last name, and already I found 3 different spellings of this last name. So again, browsing, is where this really helps out. So then I can find out that this Louis Harper is actually a younger brother of Linda's mother, Amelia. I see he's 5 months old, the date of death, and it does have the place of death is Red Paint Bay. Don't actually know where that is in Lake Nipigon. I haven't searched that out yet. So this is something that I'll have to follow up on, but I know that that's where the family was living at the time. And then going further down, I can see that it was registered at Orient Bay. So again, that's a different area. So that's something I'm going to have to follow up on. It means that there is no registration in Red Paint Bay. So the family had to travel, probably not that far a distance, but they did have to travel because there was no place to register in their own community. Another thing to note on this page is, so I see that this is how Rosie's last name is spelled in this record. And coincidentally, right beside Louis Harper is a Mary Chabougijic. And so I'm assuming that that is probably Rosie's mother. And that was information that I didn't have. I had no idea who Rosie's parents were. Also didn't know where Rosie's from. And you can see Mary's place of birth is Fort Albany. So that was totally new information for me, which means that this family is probably Cree. And that was something that nobody in the family had any idea about. So this is really an exciting piece of information to find. I'm not sure whether Rosie was born in Fort Albany or whether Mary and her husband traveled from Fort Albany to the Lake Nipigon area, or whether Rosie's mother's family traveled. That's something that I still have to explore a little bit. But browsing through the records was able to give me this information again, because I was spelling this last name totally differently. I would have never found this if I was just using the search function. So back to sort of how I found out that information about the Harper side of the family. I did talk to that local researcher that I mentioned who ended up being related, and he had tons of information, church records that he got. And so this is a transcription of a bunch of church records. It's basically an amalgamation. Somebody has taken all the church records, gone through them, and created this family tree based on those records. So I see there's Charles and his wife Amelia, and this gives Charles's parents' names, Joseph Denny, and there's that Mitigo. So I know, okay, so that person who had Mitigo in their family tree was correct, because here's that name in the church records associated with the right people I'm looking for. And then there's Charles's mother, Mary Ann Manitoshans. And it has her parents as well. It also has Joseph's parents in this record here. And then we can go to the next one. It'll switch it for me. And so this keeps going further back. So this is a really great resource. There is Joseph Denny, married to Mary Ann Manitoshans. So those are Charles's parents, and it has Joseph's parents here, Thomas Denny and Marguerite, and it's got her parents, it's got Thomas's parents. So this has tons of information that I didn't have before, because again, Linda only had up to Joseph. So I got lots more from this record here. And then it goes back even further here. It has, here's Thomas here, and his parents, Ningabian and Wabano. And I just saw somebody raise their hand. I don't know, Maddie, if they put a question in the chat or if they're able to unmute themselves to ask their question.
I can, oh wait, hand is unraised, but I could have unmuted them, but just go
yeah, whoever raised your hand, if you want to ask your question,
or
go ahead.
if it was an accident, that was cool too.
Yeah.
We are getting close to 2, Jenna, just so.
Yes. Yeah. I'm gonna, somebody else raised their hand.
There we go. I'll allow that to speak. There we go.
Yeah, if you're able to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes, I can.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm way back into the 1700s.
Nice.
Now, and that's where I'm stuck. According to what happened is she married, a great-great-great-grandmother married an individual who they were saying was a fur trader. in Montreal. She was 30 years old when they got married. So they baptized the children and then married her. And then from what I can see on the documents, it says the Sioux Nation.
Okay.
But I'm kind of stuck at that. So where would you ever go from there? Because on the baptismal and marriage certificate, there's nothing for her parents.
Mm-hmm. So because that's so far back, I think it's going to be really difficult to find information because the Sioux would be more west, in which case there is not as much settlement that far. So then there's not as many Western records related to that community. So I don't really have any good suggestions for you, unfortunately. I mean, you're really lucky to have gotten back that far at all. So I think you might just be stuck in terms of getting back any farther than that. Although you can try and reach out to Sioux communities that are further out west and see, you know, what records they have access to. There might be other researchers that work with those communities that might have more information. So that would be what I would suggest, would be to try and get in touch with somebody from one of those Sioux communities.
There's a suggestion in the chat to check the Jesuit records as well.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so I'm just going to really briefly go over the treaty pay lists, and then I will open it up for questions. So this is an example of what a sort of treaty pay list record looks like. This one actually has information about people who the Indian agent was recommending be removed from the pay list. So this has lots more information because scrolling down, it's got sort of an explanation of why these people were recommended to be removed. So sometimes when you're searching for annuity pay lists, you'll find records like this. I think somebody else had their hand raised. I just saw it.
Yep, give me 1 second here. There's
A couple
two
people
more.
with questions, yeah.
I will, Marjorie, go ahead.
If you're able to unmute yourself, Marjorie, you can ask your question.
I set it up so you should be able to. If not, just type it in the chat and we'll answer it from there too.
Okay, I'm just going to go to this last pay list quickly, and then we can open it up for questions. So this is what an actual pay list looks like. It'll have the name of the head of household, as I mentioned, and then it lists the people who are in that family. So it says, you know, how many men, how many women, how many boys, how many girls, how many people total, and the total amount they were paid. So for the Robinson Superior Treaty, it's $4 a year. So it lists out how many people were paid. And then sometimes there's notes at the end here, which can give you information about, you know, whether somebody in the family has died. This one here says boy dead. This one says girl married. So she's married out of the family, in which case she's not included in this head of house pay list. And then again, just a quick note about spelling. So I had that information about the ancestor going far back. His name was Ningabian. I see here there's this Nakapian. And so it's not quite the same, but if you say it out loud, you can kind of hear how they're very similar. And then I know that in writing Anishinaabemowin, K's and G's are often interchangeable, and so are B's and P's. So I'm pretty sure that this is the right family that I'm looking for. So quick summary of that, and then we'll take questions. So of course, make sure to treat oral history as a valid source. So any information you get from your family, from community oral history, important to mentally treat it as an actual source on its own. Keep track of your search process and your sources. So how you've gone about searching, where you searched, what information you found, where you found it is really important. Learn as much as you can about local history. That'll help provide some context and might give you some leads for where to go further. Take advantage of local archives and local historians. As I said, there was tons of information I got from that local historian that it would have taken me ages and years to find. And, you know, he already spent the years finding it for me. So he was a really great resource. Keep in mind that names of people and locations often change. So you might have to try searching different ways, searching in different places, browsing. And don't give up if the search forms aren't yielding results or if it's taking a long time. Doing your genealogy is a huge process. It does take a really long time. It's not something you're going to do in a week or a month or even a year. Again, I've been researching my husband's family for multiple years now, and I've got lots of blank spots all over the place. So it is a process. It does take lots of time. It does take lots of thinking. Sometimes I just get so overwhelmed and my brain is swirling around with so many dates and names, I have to take a break. But we are always here to help. You can definitely reach out to the SRSC if you are struggling with doing this, and you can always come back to this presentation for review. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then we can take questions.
Okay, cool. There's a couple.
We are a little over time.
We'll do some speed runs of questions.
Yes.
There's a few in the Q&A that have been sitting for a bit. So this one is from Karen Cedarwall. How do you access the treaty pay lists? INAC would never release the info when they had checked years ago.
Yeah, so it's really difficult to find some of those pay lists. A lot of them are on Library and Archives Canada. So I do have a link to the website in the handout. That's where I found most of the pay list records that I have. Library and Archives Canada also does have an Indigenous genealogy department. So you can always reach out to them as well. I don't have their contact information, but LAC does have like a contact page, and you can reach out to them and then they can give you the contact information for the Indigenous genealogy department.
And then Joanne wants to know, how are Indigenous roots going to appear in church records? Would the priest or minister indicate Indigenous ancestry?
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Usually it's just based on the community. So again, some of the church records that I've found are from missions to Indigenous communities. So it's pretty clear that those people in that record are Indigenous. But again, sometimes it will list whether they're Indigenous or not. It is also one of those things that you corroborate by looking at other documents. So the census records, again, sometimes will list race and it'll say Indian on there. So you're sort of using the information you're getting from all of the records and not just one record.
And then Lise has a question. Is it easy to access Hudson Bay Company records? Are they all online and free, or do we contact the company? Same for other companies like the Northwest Company.
Yeah, so that's something that I've only just recently started looking into. They do have a website with an index, but I think it's only just settler employees. That's something I have to look into a bit further to find out where those records that contain trading information with Indigenous communities are. Yeah, you probably have to reach out to them. There is a Hudson's Bay Archives. Again, that's where the index of employees is. So I'm sure you could reach out to one of the archivists associated with that and find out where records of Indigenous people are and how to access them. Yeah, Krista just posted the link in the chat to the Hudson's Bay Archives.
Thank you, Krista. This question is from Robert. I'm having some trouble tracking family connections back into Quebec through Ancestry. Am I right that the ethnicity fields for older census records in Quebec seem less helpful, accurate for Indigenous peoples than in other provinces?
Yeah, the Quebec records are a little bit more difficult. I've found that a lot of the records related to Quebec are in the Drouin collection. So that's the Catholic record collection. There also is a database online which you have to subscribe to that has really great records, but sometimes it doesn't necessarily say whether a person is Indigenous or not. Again, similar sort of problems with church records in Ontario, where you have to kind of guess by the name and by the community whether the person is Indigenous or not.
Okay. And then a question from Avalon. Are the records for Xinguang digitized or being digitized? We can both field this one. There are some that are digitized. There are some that were in the process of being digitized, but COVID kind of put a delay on that. And there's some that just aren't quite on the list yet, but if there is anything you would particularly like, the chances are we can scan it and have it sent off to you.
Yeah, you can always reach out to us and we can help get you a copy of the document.
This one is from Karina. I work in a public library and the biggest thing I get is people who are very eager to prove Indigenous ancestry, but don't necessarily want to do the research. How would you recommend responding?
So yeah, that's something that I get a lot. So I do research outside of this as well, outside of my job at the SRSC. And there's lots of people who think they have an Indigenous connection and don't. So I would basically just, tell them that any genealogy, whether it's Indigenous or not, is work. And so if they want proof, they have to put in the work. And if they're not willing to put in the work, there's really nothing that you can do. Either they're willing to put in the work themselves or they're willing to shell out the money to hire a researcher to do it for them. Those are really the only two things that they can do.
We're over time already, so we'll field a couple more questions and then unfortunately we will have to cut it off. But just to butt that in there, if you have any other questions to ask, you can email us at xinguangdg@algomiu.ca. I'll pop that link into the chat as well. But we'll field a couple more in the time being. So from the chat, are there any records where Indian agents changed family names?
I don't know that there's records kept about those name changes. I think that's something that you kind of have to find out from family history, from oral history. It's also, again, you might not know that a name was changed, but if you're struggling to find the person with the same name when you go further back, that might be an indication that a name has changed. And so that was the case for me. I was struggling to find, even with Nanine, I was struggling to find it had been changed even from that. So it's just one of those things where you're like, okay, I'm stuck. What do I do now? And that's where I was saying, language plays a part. If you know the English name, you can try and figure out, well, what would this name be in Anishinaabemowin? And, try searching with that. So for example, like if the last name is Stone, you can try searching Assiniboine and see if anything comes up with that.
And we'll take one more from the chat very quickly. What types of software are available or can you use for creating your own archives or family tree, and what would you suggest?
Yeah, so if you're working on, building out your family history and you want somewhere to be able to save all your records, I recently started using Roots Magic, which is a software. It's about $34. So it is one of the cheaper genealogy softwares. It basically will pull in all your records. It will create family trees for you. You can add lots of notes and things. I've been finding it a really great resource to use. I'll just put it in the chat what it's actually called. So that's a really great software that I like to use. Yeah, somebody just asked, do I have a subscription with the software? It's just like a one-time fee. It's not a subscription service. So it is $34 for Roots Magic. I think that's US $34. It is, again, one of the cheaper genealogy softwares. There's lots of other ones that are like $100+. So definitely Roots Magic is one that I would recommend if you're just, wanting a place to organize your own personal research. Okay.
And with that, we're almost 15 minutes over time. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around and having so many really, really great questions. Again, I'm going to post our email in the chat as well. Jenna had done it earlier, but xinguangdg@algomiu.ca. If you send us an email, we can answer any questions. or try and field anything that might come up later as you have it. So just thank you, Jenna, for such an informative and interesting presentation. And thank you all for sticking around. Oh, and before I forget,
Thanks, everybody.
this will be posted on YouTube for everybody who's asking. I just need time to process it, and probably by tomorrow, end of day, it'll be available publicly for everybody. I will post it on this SRSC's Facebook, as well as directly into the event for this webinar. So thank you all for coming.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.